Fantastic. Thank you so much. And thank you again for inviting me to join with you fine people today to talk about Star Trek. It's always a pleasure and an opportunity to be able to talk about one of the things I love most in the world, and that is Star Trek. But without much further ado, let us begin. So I am here today to talk about the future that forgot itself. Star Trek Discovery and the non-linearity of progress. The problem we're going to be discussing essentially is the problem of progress. We often imagine the future as a straight line with better technology, better medicine, wiser institutions, greater prosperity, more stable societies, a deeper understanding of ourselves and of the universe. But history doesn't move in straight lines. Civilizations can advance in some areas while stagnating in others. They can become more technically sophisticated while becoming less socially confident. They can preserve symbols while losing the systems that underpin them. They can inherit technologies that they no longer fully understand, or deliberately restrict knowledge because earlier generations learned that some capabilities were undesirable. My core thesis today is that progress is not inevitable. The future has to be maintained. Today, I want to use Star Trek as a case study in that problem. What happens when a fictional future begins to look less like inevitable progress and more like a civilization carrying the scars of decline? And for the purposes of this talk, I'm going to treat Star Trek as an internal history, not why did the producers design it this way or why did the writers write it this way, but what would these changes imply if the civilization were real? In other words, we're going to pretend that the Star Trek canon is a historical archive or record that's being sent back in time from some distant future, and we're going to imagine that it's all real and consistent with our universe. But before we get too far, I'm going to need to establish some facts. I presume that not everybody in the room has the same level of familiarity with Star Trek than I do. So I'm going to just anchor a couple of points in the Star Trek canon so that we can jump off from there and discuss on the same equal footing. And what we really need here is a kind of timeline of the Star Trek universe. Now, the Star Trek canon spans a massive period of time, and we're not going to be talking about all of it. We only need certain key moments. But to contextualize what those are, let us think about these four periods. The first one being the 23rd century. So this is, if you're graying at the temples like me, this is probably the first Star Trek that you encountered. This began as the original series, the period of Kirk, Spock, McCoy, the original USS Enterprise, and has since been expanded upon with additional series. The animated series, the first two seasons of Star Trek Discovery, we'll be speaking at length about that in a moment. Strange New Worlds, and a number of feature films are all kind of set in that period, the mid 23rd century. So that's roughly 2250 up to about 2290. That's what we call the TOS era, the original series. In this period, the Federation, or the United Federation of Planets, the Federation for short, is still relatively young. It's been around for a century or so, and it's expanding rapidly. It has a strong exploratory focus. It's sometimes a little rough around the edges. It has kind of a cowboy frontier vibe, and it's still defining what Starfleet and the Federation itself are going to become in the future. Important to note again that the first two seasons of Star Trek Discovery are set in this period, actually about 10 years before the original series. Star Trek Discovery is a spin-off show that details the adventures of one ship, the USS Discovery, and her crew, and it begins here. It starts off during the Klingon War, not long before the original series. And then at the end of the second season, the Discovery and her crew are teleported into the distant future, and we'll get to that in a moment. The next period that we need to talk about is the 24th century, also known as the TNG era. Well, TNG stands for the Next Generation, which was the first series introduced in this period. And that's kind of the mid 24th century, around 2360, all the way to the first couple of years of the 25th century, 2402. So that's the Next Generation and additional spin-offs, Deep Space Nine, Voyager, Lower Decks, Prodigy, and Picard. They all kind of span that period of 3 or 4 decades there. For this talk, this period is the benchmark. This is the before picture. Not because this area is perfect, but because this, at least in my view, this period represents the Federation at or near its peak, at its mature high point. At this time, in the 24th century, the Federation has stable interstellar institutions. It's got reliable interstellar travel. If you want to go to a different planet, it's almost trivially easy for you to do that. It has advanced medicine. They very rarely encounter medical issues that they can't solve. It has normalized mental health care, which is included in that. It has post-scarcity assumptions. Your average Federation citizen is able to live out their lives without ever wanting for material goods, whether that's food, clothing, shelter, whatever. Those issues are covered through replicated technology and that kind of thing. It has a strong scientific culture. There seems to be a social awareness that it's science and technology that has led to this utopian state of existence. And everybody recognizes and is grateful for that. More or less everybody. There is confidence in exploration. So although exploration is still ongoing, everybody kind of trusts the process of exploration, that it's going to expand the Federation's sphere of influence. We're going to find new members for the Federation, new friends, new allies, also new enemies. But overall, on balance, exploration as an enterprise, you see what I did there, is a positive experience. It leads to broad interstellar cooperation. Sorry, I've got a cat who's jumping on my microphone. It leads to broad interstellar cooperation, both within the Federation and also with Federation's neighbors, allies, and even enemies, which all leads to a clear sense of civilizational purpose. The Federation as a civilization seems to know what it is, know what it wants, and know where it's going. So that's why we're treating this as the before picture. The 24th century Federation isn't impressive only because it has powerful technology, which it does have. It's impressive because it has the institutions, confidence, and social systems needed to make that technology part of a functioning civilization. After that period, we have a gap, the missing centuries, of about 800 years, for which we have very little information. During that time, we have only little snippets, bits and pieces here or there to sort of tie it together and figure out what happened during that period. So what we do know is that during that period, the Federation continues to exist. We know that technology continues to develop, at least in some areas. We know that some major events happen, and we even know what a couple of those events are. We'll speak about what that is shortly. But we don't have a detailed century by century history. We just don't have that information. There are no series that are set in that period. So we're not moving directly from the TNG era to the TNG era, but shinier. We're crossing a long and mostly unseen stretch of history in this gap. And part of what we're going to do today is going to answer, to some extent, what happened during those missing centuries, although we don't have complete information. And then we arrive in the 32nd century. So remember I spoke about how Star Trek Discovery, first 2 seasons are about the Discovery working in the 23rd century, and then they transport forward in time. This is where they land, in the 32nd century, distant future, and that shift is permanent. The seasons 3, 4, and 5, which are the last 3 seasons of the show, all set in the 32nd century. They never actually go back. And the world they find there is not simply a more advanced version of the Federation they left behind. It's a wounded, broken version. At this point, the Federation does still exist. Starfleet still exists, after a fashion, and the advanced technology that they know still exists. But the Federation has shrunk dramatically. Important planets like Earth, Vulcan, Beta Z, they're no longer part of the Federation. Interstellar travel has become a lot more difficult than it used to be. Trust between worlds has weakened and frayed. Starfleet's reach has been massively reduced, and the galaxy feels a lot less connected than it once was. This is the first major clue that we are not looking at ordinary progress, we're looking at uneven progress after trauma. What trauma, you might be asking? Well, that's that blank spot in the middle there. We mentioned the burn. Identified in dialogue over and over again in the last 3 seasons of Discovery is an event called the Burn, which happens roughly a century before the Discovery arrives in that future. This is an event in which it was a galaxy-wide catastrophe in which all dilithium simultaneously became inert. That's a little bit of technobabble, but essentially dilithium is an essential component of virtually every warp drive, warp being the faster than light travel system that they use in Star Trek. And it became inert, which meant that warp travel was no longer possible for any ship that already had dilithium on board. And in fact, if a ship was traveling at warp when that happened, when the cataclysm erupted, that ship was destroyed with all hands on board. So that means that warp travel became more dangerous and constrained. Suddenly, all these warp-capable ships were no longer able to achieve warp. Dilithium, that precious material, became strategically critical. It was still possible to find natural sources of dilithium, but it was already a rare material, and now even more rare because any piece of dilithium that was in a warp core is now useless. We have to go and replenish and replace all of that dilithium, which meant that worlds became isolated. Worlds that were perhaps some distance away by warp were now unreachable by any meaningful stretch of the imagination. The Federation became fragmented, and interstellar trust, as a result, eroded and collapsed, leaving a power vacuum that was filled by interstellar gangster cartels and people like that. But here's the important nuance that I want to talk about. Even though the burn is identified in Star Trek, in dialogue, by the characters as being the cause for this disrupted future, my thesis is that the burn may not have created the Federation's decline. It may have sealed it. The burn is an obvious disaster, and it had disastrous repercussions for the Federation and everybody else for that matter. But it may not have been the original disease. It may have been the final shock to a civilization that was already weakened by long-term instability. There's another event that is significant here, and I want to mention it while we're talking about timeline discussions because it's relevant. Some years or decades, we're not sure exactly when, before the burn, there was something else that happened. Now, throughout Star Trek canon, there have been multiple references to a temporal war. So this is a war that took place with time travel, traveling back and forth, different factions trying to out-time travel each other by raising each other from history or altering the flow of time in their favor or somebody else's favor. And although being time travel related, this war has taken place throughout time, past and future. But we are told at various times in the Star Trek canon that this war came to a head in the early 31st century. Now we learn that after that flashpoint of the temporal war in the early 31st century led to a series of temporal accords, interstellar treaties that effectively ended the temporal war. And the way they did that was to outlaw time travel. Now, this is tricky because time travel, at least in the Star Trek universe, isn't just one technology. It's not just one thing that you can do. You can't just outlaw that kind of machine and now we're done. There are many, many different ways of traveling through time in Star Trek. And also, technology doesn't work like that. You can't just cut off one application of one specific technology because technology builds on itself, right? It would require you to cut off whole fields of study that led ultimately to the application of time travel. So if areas like temporal mechanics, chronoton research, which is a form of power, exotic subspace physics, which is communication, advanced transporter theory, which is beaming back and forth, predictive timeline modeling, which is mathematics, frankly, certain propulsion experiments that are capable of traveling faster than the speed of light, other than simple warp, sensor systems that interact with temporal phenomena. All of these would have been impacted by that ban on time travel. By analogy, imagine in today's world, society deciding to outlaw human reproductive cloning for moral reasons. It's not an unreasonable thing to do. But if you're not careful about how you do that, other fields might be impacted by the fear of cloning. And it could chill or restrict research into things like genetics, tissue engineering, organ growth, fertility medicine, cellular repair, stem cell therapy, fields that aren't the same thing as reproductive cloning, but are similar enough, at least in their fundamentals, that they also get effectively outlawed or at least hobbled because of that ban on human cloning. Likewise, once time travel becomes a civilizational threat, the safest political response may be to restrict far more than just the time machines. The Federation may have deliberately amputated parts of its own scientific future in order to survive the consequences of that temporal war. Some technologies may not have been forgotten, some may have been deliberately buried. But before we continue with the Federation, I want to step away from Star Trek for a moment. Yeah, just a couple of slides. Here we go. Because if we're going to talk about decline, collapse, and regression, we need to resist the cinematic version of collapse. One explosion, one invasion, one disaster, one clean before and after. Real decline is often slower and stranger than that. It can happen inside ordinary lives, year by year, until the people living through it have adjusted to a smaller world without fully noticing what they've lost. Imagine an old woman sitting by a fire. She's very old now, perhaps close to 100, though nobody in her village really knows her age, not even her. The children think that she's always been old, wrapped in wool and smoke and memory. But she remembers another world. When she was a girl, the world was louder. That's what she remembers first. Roads with carts on them, hooves and wheels, traders sleeping beneath their wagons, guards at the gates, smiths hammering metal from dawn until nightfall, men speaking languages she didn't understand, bringing goods from places she'd never seen. She remembers going with her father to one of the great fortified places on the hill. She remembers the gates, the sound they made when they opened, the smell of charcoal fires, animals, sweat, oil, worked metal, wine, dust, and smoke. She remembers tools and weapons that caught the sun. She remembers colored cloth. She remembers seals and storehouses, and men who could make meaning out of marks pressed into clay. Now the fort stands above the hill, it stands above the valley, still, quiet. The roofs are gone. The wells are fouled. The road is broken. Trees grow where people once gathered. Her grandchildren are afraid of that place. To them, it's a ruin, a place of snakes, ghosts, and old stones. They cannot imagine it alive. And that is the cruelest part. They don't know that they are poor. Not really. They don't know the world is smaller than it used to be, because this smaller world is the only one they have ever known. The old woman remembers when the traders stopped coming as often. Then the good metal became rare. Then one year nobody repaired the road after the rains tore part of it away. Then the scribes disappeared. Then another town stood empty. Then another. No one moment felt like the end of the world. There was no one single night when civilization died. The world simply became quieter, poorer, less colorful, more dangerous, more local. Each year, a little less connected than the year before. And because it happened slowly, people learned to live with less without ever fully understanding how much had vanished. Now, near the end of her life, the old woman understands something her grandchildren cannot. She was born in one world, and she will die in another. The woman never existed, but people like her almost certainly did. The world we've just imagined is somewhere in the Eastern Mediterranean, the Aegean, or the Anatolian world around 1200 to 1100 BCE, during what historians call the Bronze Age collapse. The collapse affected major interconnected societies, including the Mycenaean kingdoms, the Hittite Empire, cities and trade networks across the Levant, Cyprus, Anatolia, Egypt, which survived the collapse but was weakened for a time. For ordinary people, collapse may not have felt like one apocalypse. It may have felt like every year bringing a little less trade, a little less safety, a little less wealth, and a little less certainty of the future. The lesson isn't simply that civilizations can fall, The lesson is that people can live through the fall slowly enough that it feels like normal life. But what was lost? First is connectivity. Bronze Age societies depended on long-distance trade. Copper, tin, grain, timber, textiles, glass, ivory, metals, diplomatic gifts. They moved across massive networks. And when those networks failed, the world became smaller. A road isn't just a road, it's a promise that the wider world still exists. People survived after the collapse, but the material world became poorer. There were fewer luxury goods, fewer imported objects, fewer specialists, less monumental construction, and less visible abundance. The loss wasn't simply that people had less stuff, it was that the loss of the systems that made abundance possible. Bronze didn't vanish instantly. Bronze production relied on systems. Copper sources in one place, tin sources in another, transport routes to connect them, skilled metallurgists to turn those different metals into bronze, political protection for those metallurgists, and stable demand to support the market. When those systems weakened, bronze became harder to sustain at scale. Technology isn't just knowledge, it's institutions, supply chains, specialists, and continuity, and infrastructure. In parts of the post-collapse, not post-apocalypse, post-collapse Aegean world, literacy disappeared for centuries. Whole societies literally forgot how to read and write. And that doesn't mean that people became less intelligent. It means that the palace bureaucracies, the scribal schools, the archives, and the administrative systems that supported writing disappeared. They were no longer required. When institutions die, knowledge can become folklore. A complex society provides predictability, safe roads, maintained ports, trusted authorities, predictable law, stable trade, storage and redistribution, confidence that tomorrow will broadly resemble today. After collapse, people still live, farm, and trade, but the world becomes more local, more dangerous, and less predictable. But cultural confidence may be the most important loss. Civilizations don't only lose wealth or technology, they lose faith in their own future. A society that once built cities, ships, roads, and palaces may become a society that simply tries to survive the next winter. Collapse isn't always the end of life, sometimes it's the end of confidence. Now that's the pattern I want to carry back into Star Trek. Not collapse as annihilation, but not regression as stupidity. Not the end of all technology or all civilization. Collapse as contraction, fewer connections, weaker institutions, rarer expertise, uneven abundance, damaged memory, and a loss of confidence. Once we have that pattern in mind, the far future Federation begins to look a little different. Not primitive or dead, but wounded, and perhaps much less advanced than it first appears. My claim isn't that the future Federation became primitive, because it clearly didn't. We'll explain in a moment what these incarnations mean. The claim is more precise. It's more like the Federation shows uneven progress. Some technologies advanced, some stagnated, some became rare, some may have been deliberately suppressed, and some social or institutional capacities regressed. And that's exactly what non-linear progress looks like. So what has been gained, lost, stagnated, restricted, or unevenly preserved? Let's start by looking at what has been gained. Before we talk about what appears to have been lost, we should see what is clearly more advanced. The far future isn't primitive by any stretch of the imagination. It has technologies the mature Federation either didn't use routinely, or had only in much cruder forms. The first and most striking one that comes to mind is programmable matter, which you can see in the image. This is the most visible new technology that's introduced in the 32nd century. Consoles, furniture, computer interfaces, tools, and ship components can reconfigure themselves dynamically. The very stuff that these things are made of can be reprogrammed and reassigned to new tasks. The environment becomes flexible in a way that goes beyond ordinary replicators or touchscreens. But the concept isn't entirely new. Something very close to programmable matter appears on Coppelius in Star Trek Picard in Season 1, all the way back and 2399, where the synth society that lives on Coppelius uses highly adaptive matter manipulation technology. Coppelius itself was the secret synth colony that was created by Maddox and Sung after the Federation's synthetic life ban. There's some pretty deep cuts there. I recommend you go back and watch Picard to catch up on that. And they were not a Federation member at the time, but we know that they joined the Federation shortly thereafter. So this primitive version of programmable matter was introduced to the Federation all the way back in the late 24th, early 25th century. So the 32nd century advance of programmable matter isn't that it suddenly exists ex nihilo, it's that Starfleet appears to have normalized and institutionalized this technology. This is not an invention from nothing, it's adoption or refinement and distribution. A next notable gimmick that the Discovery crew all carry is a thing called the Tricom badge. So my badge here is what we call a com badge. It's a badge integrated with a communicator. But in the 32nd century, they have a much more sophisticated device on their chest called a Tricom badge. And it combines several pieces of familiar Starfleet equipment into one device. It's a com badge, a tricorder, which is a scanning device. It's a computer, a holographic pad, which is like a tablet or a phone, and a portable transport activator. But again, none of these functions are new by themselves. The com badge itself is ancient technology. It was first introduced in the 23rd century. The tricorder is older than that. The pad is older still. We have pads today. The transporter also is 22nd century technology. Holographic interfaces have been around since at least the 23rd century. What is new is the integration of all those features into one miniaturized device. So instead of separate devices having to handle multiple pieces of equipment, the functions are all collapsed into one single wearable tool that's essentially part of your uniform. The Tricom badge isn't a new category of technology, it's a bundle of all the technologies made compact enough to wear. Third tool is routine personal transporters. So transporter technology isn't new, dates back to the 22nd century. In fact, it's foundational to the Star Trek franchise. The very oldest episodes we have in terms of the chronology, the internal chronology of Star Trek, date back to 2156, and transporters are in effect there even. What seems new is the routine, wearable personal use of transporter access. Crew members of the Discovery move freely about the ship, not simply walking through corridors or using turbo lifts, but beaming from room to room. We often see characters beaming from one room into the next room, where they could simply have walked through a door they will choose to transport, because it's that much easier and simpler for them to do so. Now that's genuine progress in miniaturization and convenience. Instead of having to make a call to the transporter operator who's able to plug in the coordinates manually, they just do it by tapping their badge once, and it somehow needs to know where, or seems to know where they want to go. But the principle isn't new, right? The breakthrough isn't transporting itself. The breakthrough is making transport personal, portable, and casual. Where's the other one? Oh, I don't have an image of that. Apologies. The fourth one that I wanted to talk about is detached nacelles. So a starship has two outrigger components to its engines that are the long cylinder-like protrusions on either side of the starship. I'm sure if you picture the Starship Enterprise, you'll imagine what the nacelles are. Starships in the 32nd century are somehow able to have their nacelles hovering and floating near the ship instead of physically connected to the ship. Starships no longer need their warp nacelles to be physically attached to the hull. Now, that's one of the easiest ways you can spot that you're in the 32nd century, is that all these ships have their detached nacelles. But the underlying principles there are not entirely new either. Two older technological ideas appear to have make detached nacelles possible. The first is coordinated automated navigation. We've seen as far back as the 2370s in the 24th century, a ship that's capable of breaking up into multiple components, and those components flying together in formation through automated helm control. It's called the USS Prometheus. We also see, dating back to the 23rd century in the Cage in 2240-something, the ability to transmit power by remote. So ships had the ability to send a power beam from one location to another with minimal or negligible loss of power through empty space through some kind of an energy transfer beam, which is exotic technology to us today, but they seem to be able to do it routinely in the 23rd century. So the detached nacelles, although they're striking as an engineering refinement, they are not an invention from nothing. They're not a new kind of starship. They're older principles, or automated coordination, and remote power transfer made reliable enough to become standard design in all starships. Then we need to look at, okay, so the far future has gained real things. The technology isn't fake. The progress isn't imaginary, but the gains are uneven. Many of them are about human interface, convenience, miniaturization, elite operational capability. But what they don't automatically restore are the deeper civilizational systems that made the mature Federation function. The clearest loss is unity. This image here is of a subspace relay station, which is the fundamental component in the subspace radio network, which allows the entire Federation to communicate through faster than light signals called subspace radio. And a network of these planted around the Federation allowed that faster than light communication to happen from one end of the Federation to the other end. Now, bear in mind that the Federation took up a significant portion of the galaxy at its height in the 24th century. And being able to have real-time communication across literally thousands of light years is what made that civilization function. It wasn't only the warp drive, it was subspace radio that made it possible. But without this subspace radio network, which was lost as a result of the burn, we lost unity. Major worlds withdrew from the Federation in the 32nd century. Earth, one of the founding members of the Federation. Ni'Var, formerly known as Vulcan, it's now the new homeworld for the reunified Vulcan and Romulan society. So Ni'Var has left the Federation. Beta Z, Trill, they all left the Federation. The Federation survives, but the shared civilizational project has fractured. Some of the core worlds that made it what it was are no longer part of that enterprise. This mirrors the post-collapse pattern, where you have large systems that fragment, you've got local survival that becomes more important than global survival, trust weakens between former allies. In fact, those former allies become effectively strangers. The Federation survives, but its world has become smaller. The 24th century's defining achievement wasn't merely warp drive, it was reliable, routine, interstellar mobility. The Federation made distance feel manageable. A starship could cross sectors, messages could move through subspace relay networks across the entire galaxy. Remote colonies and outposts weren't isolated villages in the dark, they were part of a wider civilizational system. By the far future, that has fractured. The warp travel does still exist. The ships are still able to move at warp if they're able to replenish their dilithium, but the cost and risk of that movement have changed dramatically. Being able to replenish that dilithium is a non-trivial obstacle. And the scarcity makes warp travel strategically constrained. Warp is no longer simply the everyday connective tissue of the Federation. It's expensive, risky, politically consequential. And the alternatives haven't solved the problem. Transwarp technology, which was originally developed by a race that was assimilated by the Borg, it still exists, but by this period it's unsafe and reliable. The courier transwarp network, as it has become known, is dangerous, in part because of the after effects of the burn. The ships that were in the transwarp network when the burn happened all blew apart in there, and it's filled with debris. So it's not safe to travel through the transwarp network. So even where faster routes exist, they are not the stable civilizational infrastructure the Federation once took for granted. For remote Federation worlds and outposts, the result is brutal. They may technically still exist somewhere within the Federation's old historical footprint, but practically they're cut off. They're too distant for routine warp travel. They're unable to rely on safe transwarp routes, and without maintained subspace relay networks to carry messages consistently across interstellar distances. So the loss isn't simply that warp got harder. The loss is connectivity itself. The galaxy didn't become physically larger, but socially, politically, and psychologically it did. It suddenly turned into a very big place. Propulsion didn't disappear, but the Federation lost the ability to make distance feel ordinary. This is the Star Trek equivalent of roads, ports, trade routes falling after collapse. The 24th century Federation presents itself as broadly post-scarcity. People don't generally steal food to survive. They're not usually trapped in poverty by geography. The Federation's citizenship implies access to a certain baseline of safety, dignity, and material security. By the far future, the 32nd century, the picture is far less even. At Federation headquarters, personnel appear to live in conditions as luxurious as anything we see in the 24th century, possibly more so. Starfleet still has beautiful spaces, advanced infrastructure, abundant food, for sophisticated medical care, and elite technology. But that abundance is not universal. Starfleet Academy, which is the second series set in the 32nd century, gives us a sharper example of Caleb Meir and his mother, Anisha. Their story suggests that some Federation citizens still live close enough to the edge that crime becomes a survival strategy. Anisha is forced into theft to survive, and Caleb's life is shaped by the consequences of losing his mother to the legal system. It's a devastating detail because it tells us that the Federation can still maintain elite centers of comfort and order, while people at the margins are desperate enough to commit crimes for basic survival. This isn't a total collapse of abundance, it's uneven abundance. And historically, that's exactly what we see after civilizational disruption. Palace centers, military hubs, and administrative capitals may preserve wealth and sophistication, while the outer world becomes poorer, more dangerous, and less connected. Federation has not lost its abundance, it's lost the ability to distribute abundance reliably. A civilization can look utopian at the center, while people at the edges are stealing food to survive. Defensive technology may be one of the clearest examples of stagnation that we see. The gap between the mature Federation and the far future Federation is roughly 800 years. For us, 800 years takes us back to the early 1200s, a world of spears, swords, bows, crossbows, shields, mail armor, cavalry, stone fortifications. Modern warfare still has the same basic needs: attack, defend, maneuver, survive, but the technology has transformed beyond recognition. We now have tanks, drones, radar, missiles, electronic warfare, aircraft carriers, composite armor, ICBMs, active protection systems, and automated defense networks. So the issue is not that Starfleet still has defense. Of course it does. The issue is that after centuries, Starfleet still appears to be using recognizably the same defensive technologies it used in the 24th century: shields, phasers, torpedoes. And not merely distant descendants of those technologies. In many cases, they look functionally almost identical, or even worse. For example, in the 24th century, we see relatively small vessels, the USS Defiant, the USS Voyager, even runabouts, which are glorified shuttlecraft, survive and navigate the extremely hostile regions like the Badlands. This is a great case in point because it's one of the few points where we can directly contrast and compare the two different periods. This region of space called the Badlands, it's a dense spatial nebula with all kinds of turbulence and plasma phenomena. It's a dangerous place to go. But they can do it. With the technology they have at hand, the navigation, shields, etc., they're able to navigate this dangerous area of space. By contrast, the upgraded USS Discovery, supposedly refitted with the best technology of the 32nd century, is badly damaged, almost destroyed by the spatial phenomena that look less survivable for her than the same hazards were for smaller 24th century vessels. That's the real point. Not that the future still has shields, but that the shields do not appear to have undergone 800 years of meaningful transformation. A 32nd century Starfleet vessel does not seem to have defensive systems that are to 24th century shields what a modern active protection system is to a medieval wooden shield. It seems to have shields, maybe better looking shields, maybe more integrated shields, but not obviously more capable shields. The disturbing possibility is not that Starfleet still uses defensive technology. It is that after 800 years, it may still be using the same defensive technology, and sometimes using it less effectively. That doesn't look like 800 years of defensive progress. It looks like 800 years of polish on the same old armor. And that can't be blamed on the burn alone. The burn can explain lost ships, broken infrastructure, fractured supply lines. It can't explain why Starfleet's defensive paradigm appears to have barely changed over the centuries before it happened. That suggests the deeper problem was already there, a long technological plateau later exposed by catastrophe. Another example is medical and psychiatric treatment. Now, this may be one of the clearest examples of social and technological regression. The mature Federation doesn't merely acknowledge psychological trauma, it appears to treat it effectively. In the 24th century, we see characters suffer severe psychological injuries. Picard after being assimilated by the Borg, Nog after losing his leg at the Battle of AR-558, Reg Barclay dealing with things like anxiety, social dysfunction, various officers dealing with grief, fear, violation, or combat trauma. They are not magically fixed overnight. The shows don't pretend that trauma vanishes in a single episode, but the overall pattern is clear. Treatment exists, it is normalized, and it produces results. We don't see the full methodology. We see Counselor Troy or Counselor Esri Dax and others providing recognizable talk therapy. But given the medical sophistication of the Federation, it's reasonable to imagine that this is only the visible human-facing layer of treatment. Behind it may be neurochemical intervention, non-invasive neurological tools, the little handheld devices with the blinky lights, diagnostic scans, therapeutic holography, controlled memory work, or some other advanced psychiatric treatment that we can't even imagine. Whatever the exact method, the system appears clinically competent. The 24th century Federation seems to know how to heal minds. The far future, the 32nd century, complicates that picture. Complicating factor is that the Doctor, the emergency medical hologram from Voyager, a vessel that was in service in the 24th century, still exists in Starfleet Academy in the 32nd century. He was originally one of the most sophisticated medical tools created by 24th century Starfleet, and after centuries of experience, he should be a living archive of Federation medical knowledge. He remains active in the 32nd century, having been active the entire time, mentoring cadets with more than 800 years of digital experience. It means we can't simply say that they forgot the technology. At least some of that knowledge should still exist. And yet, in the far future, psychological treatment appears less effective. The culture still talks constantly about feelings, trauma, and support, but it often seems cathartic rather than therapeutic. People express emotion. They're practically wandering the halls, weeping and rending their garments, but they do not appear to recover. They process, but they don't necessarily become more stable, resilient, or professionally regulated. It's something of a meme that the crew of Discovery do little, but wail and weep between battles. And that suggests something more subtle has changed. The Federation may not have lost the psychiatric science in the narrow technological sense. It may have moved away from using it as medicine. The Doctor is especially revealing here. On Voyager, he functioned as the ship's only doctor, and psychiatric treatment was part of his medical role, even if he wasn't designed specifically as a psychiatrist. He dealt with mental health as part of whole person care. If centuries later he appears unwilling or unable to treat trauma with the same clinical confidence, that suggests the shift is not purely technological, it may be cultural. Perhaps standards of care have changed. Perhaps norms around intervention changed. Maybe Starfleet medicine became more cautious about altering emotional states. Maybe trauma came to be treated primarily as identity, narrative, or lived experience rather than an injury to be clinically healed. Perhaps the machinery of recovery still exists, but the culture no longer believes it should be used in the same way. That's a darker, more interesting, perhaps, possibility. The far future may not have lost the tools of psychiatric treatment. It may have lost the medical culture that allowed those tools to be used. Something has clearly been lost here. Not compassion, not knowledge, but the conviction that trauma is something that medicine should actually heal. In Starfleet Academy, we see some interesting anomalies. Now, on the Discovery, we see regular use of elite operational technology, programmable matter, integrated tricoms, advanced uniforms that reconfigure themselves from one mission to the next, personal transporters, flexible ship systems. But in Starfleet Academy, which is set in the same period, it gives us a very different view. Instead of a ship of the line that's out in space on the frontier, it's a school back home in the core of the Federation on Earth, which has now rejoined the Federation after a period of not being part of it. Here we see a more restrained institutional environment. We see a return to physical pads, something like a tablet or a phone, like we have today, turbo lifts to move around the building instead of transporting from room to room. In fact, we see that cadets are forbidden from using transporters on campus. A more familiar school infrastructure with chairs and desks instead of holodecks. There's less evidence of every cadet having the full integrated tool set seen on Discovery. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean that Starfleet lacks the advanced technology. In fact, we know that they don't. It may mean that the technology is not universally distributed or normalized. And we can postulate why that might be the case. The technology might be expensive. It might be restricted for security reasons. It might require authorization. It could be considered unsafe for cadets. Maybe Starfleet wants cadets trained on the fundamentals first before they access the more advanced technology. Maybe post-collapse institutions are wary of dependency on technological gadgets. Maybe advanced systems are reserved for specialist operational use. A civilization can possess a technology without trusting itself to distribute it evenly. That makes the temporal accords feel less abstract and ties it directly back into what we've already built here. A ban on time travel technology may have chilled whole families of research that also fed into the ordinary Starfleet systems: shields, weapons, transporters, propulsion, sensors, predictive modeling. Some technologies may not have been lost through collapse. Some may have become rare through scarcity. Some may have stagnated because institutions weakened. Some may have been forgotten because knowledge chains broke. But some may have been deliberately forbidden. The Federation still remembers its ideals. Its symbols survive. Its moral language survives. Its name survives. But the systems that once made those ideals work appear damaged. This is the Bronze Age comparison. A civilization can remember its myths long after it has forgotten its machinery. The far future Federation isn't primitive, it's tired. The mature Federation of the 24th century wasn't advanced merely because it had better machines. It had reliable mobility, strong institutions, normalized psychological support, confidence in exploration, stable interstellar cooperation, broadly distributed abundance, trust in science and systems. So when the far future lacks or weakens these things, we aren't just seeing a darker aesthetic. We're seeing a civilization that has lost some of its own operating principles. The real loss is not what the future has fewer gadgets. The real loss is that the future seems less sure of itself. Let's look at another historical parallel, right here in Southern Africa. The Bronze Age collapse gives us one model of civilizational contraction, but we should not leave the discussion trapped in the Eastern Mediterranean. Southern Africa gives us its own examples of complexity, connection, decline, and historical forgetting. Mapungubwe, flourishing around the 13th century, was not a primitive settlement. It was a stratified society with elite leadership, specialized production, gold and ivory trade, and connections reaching through the East African coast into the wider Indian Ocean world, a trade network that spanned thousands of kilometers. Mapungubwe's growth depended on hierarchy, specialization, and trade, with access to gold and ivory and links to the Arab, Indian, and Chinese trade networks. Great Zimbabwe followed as one of the major centers of Southern African complexity. It was a large, stone-built political and economic center connected to regional and long-distance exchange. Archaeological summaries have revealed that Great Zimbabwe, as part of a wider system involving gold, ivory, and craft production and Indian Ocean trade, just like Mapungubwe before it. The important point is not that these societies collapsed in exactly the same way as the Bronze Age world, because they didn't. The point is that the complexity shifted. The power moved, the trade routes changed, the environmental pressures exerted influence, political authority was reorganized. Centers that had once been important lost their centrality. In the case of Mapungubwe, scholars have connected its decline to climatic stress and a shift in power and trade toward Great Zimbabwe. For Great Zimbabwe itself, explanations for decline include political change, environmental pressure, shifts in trade, and the movement of power to successor states. That is useful because it reminds us that civilizational decline doesn't always mean that everything burns down. Sometimes the center moves. Sometimes the trade network reorients itself. Sometimes the political system transforms. Sometimes the great center is abandoned, but the people, knowledge, and culture continue elsewhere in an altered form. And then there's the second loss, memory. Later colonial narratives notoriously struggled to accept the Great Zimbabwe had been built by indigenous African societies. Its sophistication was minimized, misattributed, or explained away. That matters because it shows that civilization can be erased twice, first when their systems decline, and again when later people refuse to remember them honestly. That connects directly back to the Federation. A civilization can survive materially while losing its center. It can preserve descendants while losing its institutions. It can leave monuments behind while later generations misunderstand what those monuments were. It can become myth before it becomes history. Civilizations can disappear twice, first materially, and then again in the stories later people tell about. But there are positive versions of this too. Ancient Egypt lasted for millennia, not as one uninterrupted upward line. It experienced repeated periods of fragmentation, collapse of central authority, invasion, economic decline, reunification, restoration, transformation. The Old Kingdom, the Middle Kingdom, and the New Kingdom were separated by intermediate periods of disruption. In any of those periods, Egypt may have simply ceased to exist. But Egypt repeatedly reassembled itself. Civilization can nearly die more than once and still recover. But it doesn't recover unchanged. The Egypt of the New Kingdom was not the Egypt of the Old Kingdom. There was continuity, but it was transformed. The far future Federation may not be a dead civilization. It may be a civilization in an intermediate period, fragmented, traumatized, reduced, but not necessarily finished. Now, the 32nd century isn't the end of Star Trek's timeline. The furthest future story we have is a Short Treks episode called Calypso. Short Treks, by the way, is a series of shorts, each episode 10 to 15 minutes long. And Calypso is the only episode that we have that's set after the 32nd century. In that episode, a human named Kraft escapes in a small pod and is rescued by the USS Discovery. The ship is empty except for Zora, the ship's onboard AI. Zora has been waiting alone for roughly 1,000 years, obeying an old order to hold position. So we're now talking about the 42nd century. Kraft comes from a world called Alcor 4. It's not a familiar name to us. Where his people are at war with an enemy called the Vidraish. The name is significant because Vidraish kind of sort of sounds a little bit like a distorted form of Federation. A name worn down by time, hostility, language, distance. At one point when Zora refers to the Federation, Kraft doesn't recognize the term. And that's the haunting detail. This is not a clear declaration that the Federation is destroyed. It's more ambiguous than that. It may mean that the Federation is gone, that the Federation has been forgotten, that the Federation transformed into something else. The name survived only as a distorted word used by its enemies. The ideal continued, but under a different form. And yet the USS Discovery still exists, still waiting, still remembering, still carrying one last fragment of the civilization that built her. That makes Calypso a perfect coda for this talk, because by then, the 42nd century, the Federation may no longer be a living institution in the way that we understand it. But one of its artifacts remains, a ship from an earlier future, still holding position after the civilization around it has passed into myth. A ship from a forgotten future, still carrying one last piece of its civilization forward. Progress is not inevitable. Collapse is not always final. Survival is not the same as continuity. Technology is not the same as civilization. Civilizations endure only when they preserve knowledge, trust, institutions, shared purpose, cultural memory, the ability to rebuild after catastrophe, and the wisdom to know which technologies to preserve, which to restrain, and which to hand to the next generation. This presentation began as an attempt to solve what looks like an inconsistency in Star Trek. The far future doesn't seem as advanced as it should be, given how much time has passed. If we want that timeline to make sense as a coherent internal history, we need an explanation for that apparent mismatch. History gives us one. It shows us that progress isn't automatic, that civilizations can plateau, fracture, forget, recover, and transform. And that is where the mirror turns both ways. We can use history to better understand Star Trek, but we can also use Star Trek to think more clearly about history, not as a straight line or inevitable movement, but as a fragile inheritance that can be lost if it's not actively maintained. The future isn't something a civilization reaches once and then owns forever. It has to be maintained, remembered, repaired, and carried forward. Because if history teaches us anything, it's that people can live among the ruins of a greater world and not even know what has been lost. And that is the warning inside the dream. A better future isn't guaranteed by better machines. It's built, defended, taught, renewed, and chosen again and again by the people who understand that civilization isn't what we inherit, it's what we refuse to let die. Okay. And that is what I prepared. Well, thank you.